Sometimes the most broken hearts still have room for unexpected love. Sometimes the loneliest souls find purpose in the most unlikely places. Elias Boone was a mountain man who had given up on second chances. At 60, he lived alone in the Colorado wilderness, carrying 15 years of regret like stones in his chest. His cabin sat empty except for memories he couldn't shake and mistakes that followed him into every sunrise. Then 2 orphaned mountain lion cubs wandered into his camp, hungry and afraid. The mother was gone, and winter was coming fast. Most folks would have chased them off or worse, but when Elias looked into their trusting eyes, something stirred in him that he thought was dead forever. What would make a hardened old trapper risk everything for 2 wild creatures? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like memories that wouldn't let go. Elias Boone stood on his cabin porch, coffee steam rising from his tin cup in the crisp September air. At 59, his weathered hands told the story of 15 years spent alone in these Colorado mountains, every scar a lesson learned, every callus a day survived. His cabin perched on a narrow ledge overlooking Willow Creek Valley, built from pine logs he'd felled himself and chinked with mud and moss that needed replacing every spring. The roof, covered in hand-split shingles, bore patches where mountain storms had tried their best to drive him out. But Elias had outlasted every tempest, just as he'd outlasted the ghosts that first drove him here. Inside, the single room held everything a man needed, and nothing he didn't. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, blackened from countless nights of warmth and solitary meals. His bed, built into the far corner, remained neatly made each morning, a habit from another life he couldn't quite shake. Above it, 3 wooden shelves held his few possessions: a Bible he rarely opened, a shaving kit that saw weekly use, and a small leather journal bound with a strip of rawhide. That journal held 15 years of careful observations, weather patterns sketched in precise detail, animal migration routes mapped with the dedication of a scholar, medicinal plant locations marked with symbols only he understood. But between those practical entries, in handwriting that grew steadier with each passing year, were thoughts he shared with no living soul. October 12th, 1868, first snow came early, found wolf tracks near the South Ridge. Sometimes wonder if the loneliness is punishment or protection. March 3rd, 1870, creek running high with snowmelt. Saw a pair of eagles teaching their young to hunt. Remembered teaching Benjamin to whittle, some memories cut deeper than others. The cubs had appeared just after dawn, emerging from the timber like ghosts made flesh. Elias had been checking his snare line when he heard the first mewling cry, soft and desperate, like a child calling for comfort in the dark. He'd frozen, every instinct screaming danger, but curiosity won over caution. They couldn't have been more than 2 months old, their spotted coats still downy, their blue eyes wide with fear and confusion. The larger of the 2, a male by his size, sat back, on his haunches, and looked directly at Elias with an expression that seemed almost human in its pleading. His sister, for Elias somehow knew she was female, pressed close against her brother's side, trembling despite the warming sun. No mother mountain lion would leave cubs this young alone unless something terrible had happened. Elias knew the ways of these mountains better than most, and what he saw before him defied every natural law. Cubs this small should have been hidden in a den, nursing and growing under their mother's fierce protection. Instead, they sat in his camp like supplicants seeking mercy. His first impulse was to back away slowly, leave them undisturbed, let nature take its course. 15 years of mountain living had taught him that wild things lived and died by their own rules, and human interference usually made things worse. But as he watched them, something twisted in his chest, a feeling he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten its name. The male cub took a tentative step forward, then another. Elias remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The cub approached his boot and sniffed carefully, then looked up again with those impossibly blue eyes. In that moment, Elias saw something that made his hands tremble. Trust. Complete. Inexplicable. Trust from a creature that should have fled from human scent. The cub pressed his small head against Elias's leg, and the sound that escaped the old mountain man's throat was part sob, part prayer. He thought of Benjamin, his son, who used to run to him with that same unquestioning faith. Benjamin, who would climb into his lap and fall asleep to stories of brave knights and distant kingdoms. Benjamin, whose fever-bright eyes had looked at him with that same desperate trust in those final hours when medicine had failed and all Elias could do was hold him close and whisper promises he couldn't keep. "Daddy will make it better," he'd said, knowing even then that he was lying. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He'd come to these mountains to escape such feelings, to bury them under the daily struggle of survival. But here they were again, embodied in two small creatures who had somehow found him in this vast wilderness. The female cub, emboldened by her brother's success, crept forward as well. She was smaller, more cautious, but when she finally pressed against his other leg, Elias felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd kept sealed for 15 years. He knelt slowly, his joints protesting after decades of hard living. The cubs didn't flee. Instead, they pushed closer, seeking warmth, seeking the comfort that only a provider could give. His weathered hands, scarred from countless encounters with trap springs and thorn bushes, hovered over their soft fur. "Where's your mama, little ones?" he whispered, his voice roughened by years of disuse in conversation. "What happened to her?" The cubs had no answer except their presence, their need, their impossible trust in a man who'd long ago lost faith in his own worthiness to protect anything precious. Winter was coming. He could smell it in the changing leaves, feel it in the sharper bite of morning air. In 6 weeks, maybe 8 if they were lucky, snow would blanket these mountains in white silence. Game would grow scarce, and temperatures would drop far below what these young creatures could survive alone. He should walk away. Every rational thought told him to leave them to whatever fate awaited. It wasn't his responsibility, wasn't his place to interfere with the natural order. He'd spent 15 years learning to accept what he couldn't change, to focus only on his own survival. But as he looked into their trusting eyes, Elias Boone felt the first stirring of something he'd thought was dead forever. The desire to protect, to nurture, to be worthy of the trust being offered so freely. Hidden behind his Bible on the middle shelf was a faded tin-type photograph he hadn't looked at in 3 years. It showed a younger Elias in his army uniform standing proudly beside a woman with kind eyes and gentle smile. Between them stood a boy of perhaps 7, grinning with the joy of childhood, one small hand on his father's belt, the other reaching toward his mother. Margaret, beautiful, patient Margaret, who had waited for him through 2 tours of duty and never once complained about the nightmares that followed him home. Benjamin, with his father's stubborn chin and his mother's compassionate heart, who collected wounded birds and tried to mend them in shoeboxes lined with soft cloth. They had been his world, his purpose, his reason for believing that goodness existed. And he had failed them both. The cubs mewed softly, bringing him back to the present moment. They were hungry. He could see it in the way they moved, the desperate edge to their cries. Whatever had happened to their mother, they'd been alone, long enough to grow weak with need. Elias Boone had spent 15 years learning to live with failure, to carry the weight of his mistakes like a stone in his chest. He'd made peace with solitude, with the echo of his own footsteps and the sound of his own voice talking to empty air. But as he knelt in the morning light with 2 orphaned cubs pressing against his legs, he felt something shift inside him. Not redemption, he wasn't fool enough to believe in that yet, but possibility, the fragile, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, he might have one more chance to do something right. The morning mist was lifting, revealing the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched beyond his valley, Somewhere out there was the truth about what had happened to these cubs' mother. Somewhere out there were answers to questions he wasn't sure he was ready to ask. But first, these little ones needed food, warmth, and safety. And Elias Boone, despite every instinct screaming caution, despite 15 years of carefully constructed solitude, found himself willing to provide all three. 3 days passed before Elias found the blood. He'd been following Willow Creek downstream, searching for sign of the cub's mother when he spotted the dark stains on the granite rocks near the water's edge. The morning sun, filtering through the aspens, cast everything in golden light that should have been peaceful. Instead, it illuminated a scene that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. Fresh paw prints pressed into the muddy bank told a story he didn't want to read. Large adult mountain lion tracks, the mother most likely, led down to the water. But mixed among them were boot prints, human boot prints, at least 3 different sets, and the heavy indentations suggested men carrying rifles. The blood wasn't old. Dark russet stains splattered the rocks in a pattern that spoke of violence, of a creature fighting for her life. Elias knelt beside the largest stain, his experienced eye reading the scene like a book written in suffering. Ambush, he murmured to himself, noting how the cat tracks showed no sign of retreat until the very end. Poor thing came down for water and walked right into them. A broken piece of rope caught his attention, tangled in the willows at the creek's edge. The fibers were new, store-bought quality, not something a mountain man would carry. These weren't fellow trappers or homesteaders. This was something else entirely. The sound of approaching horses reached him before he saw them, 3 riders picking their way down the game trail he'd used to reach the creek. Elias melted back into the timber, his movements as silent as smoke. 15 years of mountain living had taught him when to be seen and when to disappear. The men who emerged into the clearing were exactly what he'd expected. Hard faces under broad-brimmed hats, rifles slung across their saddles, and the kind of swagger that came from men who took what they wanted and asked permission later. The leader, a tall man with graying whiskers and cold eyes, dismounted near the blood-stained rocks. "This is where we got her, boys," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Biggest female I've seen in 5 years. That pelt alone will fetch $50 in Denver." "What about the cubs, Harwick?" asked a younger man, still mounted, nervously scanning the tree line. Tracks showed she had young ones. Harwick spat into the creek. "Cubs are worth more alive than dead. Town folks back east pay good money for exotic pets. We'll find them, don't you worry." The third man, stocky with arms like tree trunks, chuckled without humor. "Assuming some mountain hermit hasn't found them first. These hills got more crazy old coots than a church has sinners. Any hermit fool enough to interfere with our business will find himself in the same state as that cat," Harwick replied, patting the rifle on his saddle. "We got contracts to fill and schedules to keep. Territory's getting civilized, which means this kind of hunting won't be legal much longer. Got to take advantage while we can." Elias felt his jaw clench. These weren't hunters. They were profiteers. The kind of men who would strip these mountains bare for a handful of coins. The kind who saw wild creatures as nothing more than commodities to be harvested. "So what's the plan?" the younger man asked, dismounting to water his horse. "We spread out, search every canyon and creek bed in a 5-mile radius," Harwick said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Got word there's an old mountain man living somewhere up near the high country. Boone, I think the name was. If those cubs are still alive, he might have seen sign of them." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. They knew who he was. Somehow these men had connected him to the cubs, or at least knew enough to consider him a potential lead. His carefully maintained isolation had been compromised. "Elias Boone," the stocky man said, recognition in his voice. "Yeah, I heard of him. Used to be Army before he went native, disappeared into these mountains maybe 15 years back. Don't matter what he used to be." Harrick replied, folding the paper and tucking it away. "What matters is he's got something we want, or knows where to find it. We'll pay him fair if he cooperates. If he doesn't, well, these mountains can be dangerous places." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Elias had faced down grizzlies, survived blizzards that would kill most men, and endured 15 years of solitude that would drive others to madness. But hearing these men discuss him like prey awakened something he'd kept buried, the part of him that had once been a soldier, that had faced down enemies who threatened everything he held dear. The cubs were back at his cabin, probably sleeping in the sun-warmed spot near his porch where they'd taken to napping. They trusted him completely now, coming when he called, following him on short walks around the clearing. In 3 days, they'd become more than just wild creatures seeking shelter. They'd become his responsibility. "How long you reckon before we find them?" the younger man asked, checking his rifle action with practiced ease. "Day or 2, maybe 3, Harwick replied, remounting his horse. "Cubs that young won't have wandered far from where we killed their mama, and if this Boone character has them, he'll hand them over quick enough once he understands the situation." The stocky man laughed again, the sound sharp and ugly in the peaceful morning air. "Assuming we ask nice first." They rode off downstream, following the creek toward the lower country where the game trails converged. Elias remained hidden until their hoofbeats faded completely, his mind racing through possibilities and preparations. He could pack up, take the cubs, and head deeper into the mountains where even these hunters wouldn't follow. But winter was coming, and traveling with young animals would be dangerous even for someone with his skills. The cubs needed stability, consistent food, and shelter from the storms that would soon sweep down from the high peaks, or he could stay and fight. 3 men with rifles against 1 aging mountain man. The odds weren't favorable, but they had one crucial disadvantage. This was his territory, his home. He knew every game trail, every hiding place, every natural fortress in a 20-mile radius. The image of the cubs sleeping peacefully on his porch made the decision for him. He'd already failed to protect one family when they needed him most. The weight of that failure had driven him into these mountains, carved hollows in his soul that 15 years hadn't filled. But these cubs, they were different. They'd chosen him, trusted him, given him a second chance he didn't deserve but couldn't refuse. Whatever it cost, whatever it required, he wouldn't fail them the way he'd failed Benjamin and Margaret. As he made his way back up the mountain toward his cabin, Elias Boone felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The cold, calculating calm of a man preparing for war. He'd been a soldier once, trained to protect what mattered most. These hunters had made a critical error. They'd threatened the only family he had left. The cubs were waiting for him when he reached the clearing, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to greet him. Their innocent joy, their complete faith in his ability to keep them safe only strengthened his resolve. "Don't you worry, little ones," he whispered, kneeling to gather them close. "Nobody's going to hurt you, not while I'm still breathing." The morning mist was burning off, revealing a crystalline sky that promised fair weather. But Elias could smell change coming on the wind, the kind of change that would test everything he'd learned about survival, about sacrifice, and about the terrible mathematics of choosing who lives and who dies. The hardest part wasn't teaching the cubs to trust him. It was learning to trust himself again. Elias spent the evening after his encounter with the hunters carving a feeding bottle from a hollow branch he'd been saving for winter kindling. His knife moved with practiced precision, but his hands trembled slightly as memories surfaced unbidden. He'd made something similar for Benjamin years ago, a wooden cup shaped like a bear when the boy was learning to drink without spilling. "Steady, old man," he muttered to himself, forcing his breathing to slow. The cubs watched from their makeshift bed of pine boughs near the fireplace, their blue eyes tracking every movement. They seemed to sense his tension, pressing closer together, but never taking their gaze off him. The female cub, he'd started thinking of her as Luna for the crescent-shaped marking on her forehead, mewed softly when he tested the bottle's flow. With water, her brother, bigger and bolder, padded over to investigate. Elias had named him Scout for his tendency to explore every corner of the cabin. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Let's see if this works." Feeding wild mountain lion cubs wasn't something covered in any manual. Elias had to rely on instinct and observation, mixing goat's milk he'd traded for months ago with water and a touch of honey. The first attempts were disasters, milk everywhere except where it needed to be, cubs frustrated and hungry, and Elias questioning every decision. But Luna learned first, her small paws gripping the wooden bottle while she drank with desperate enthusiasm. Scout took longer, more suspicious of the contraption, but eventually hunger won over caution. Watching them feed, seeing their bellies round with nourishment, stirred something in Elias's chest that he'd thought was permanently buried. It felt like purpose. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Samuel Morrison rode up the mountain trail on his old mare, his black medical bag bouncing with each step. Elias heard him coming long before he appeared. The doctor had never learned the art of moving quietly through the woods. "Morning, Elias," Morrison called, dismounting with the careful movements of a man past 70. "Thought I'd check on you. Before the snow flies?" Morrison had been making these monthly visits for 3 years now, ever since he'd treated Elias for a severe case of pneumonia. The old doctor claimed it was professional concern, but Elias suspected it had more to do with loneliness. Morrison's wife had died 5 years back, and his children lived back east. "Doc," Elias nodded, but his eyes kept scanning the tree line. The hunters could return at any time, and Morrison's presence would complicate everything. "You seem tense," Morrison observed, tying his horse to the hitching post Elias had built. "More than usual, I mean." Before Elias could respond, Scout poked his head around the cabin corner, curiosity overcoming caution. Morrison froze, his weathered face cycling through confusion, amazement, and concern. "Elias," he said carefully, "there appears to be a mountain lion cub on your porch." "2 of them, actually," Elias replied, watching as Luna joined her brother. "Found them 3 days ago, orphaned." Morrison approached slowly, his medical training overriding any fear. "My lord, they're beautiful and young, can't be more than 8 weeks old." He looked up at Elias with sharp eyes. "What happened to their mother?" Elias told him about the blood by the creek, the hunter's conversation, the threat hanging over his small valley like a thundercloud. Morrison listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail. "Howick," the doctor spat. When Elias finished, "That man's been trouble since he showed up in these parts. No respect for anything living, just sees dollar signs where others see God's creation. You know him?" "Know of him. He and his men have been through town twice. This month, selling pelts and asking questions about the high country. Sheriff doesn't like them, but they haven't broken any laws he can prove." Morrison knelt beside the cubs, who had grown brave enough to approach. Scout sniffed his extended hand, while Luna hung back, still cautious around strangers. "What are you planning to do?" Morrison asked. "Keep them safe," Elias said simply. "Whatever it takes." The doctor studied him for a long moment. "That's going to be dangerous, my friend. These men aren't the type to give up easily." "Neither am I." Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Elias had seen from him in months. "No, I don't." "Suppose you are. What do you need?" The question caught Elias off guard. He'd grown so accustomed to handling everything alone that the offer of help felt foreign. "Supplies, mostly. Milk, medicine in case they get sick, maybe some fabric for warmer bedding." "Consider it done." Morrison reached into his bag and pulled out a small bottle of cod liver oil. "This will help keep them healthy through winter. A few drops in their milk every other day." As if sensing they were being discussed, Luna finally approached the doctor, her natural curiosity overcoming her fear. Morrison remained perfectly still as she sniffed his coat, his boots, his medical bag. "She's got intelligence in those eyes," Morrison observed. "Both of them do. They're going to grow into magnificent creatures. If I can keep them alive that long, you will." Morrison's voice carried quiet confidence. "I've seen how you handled challenges, Elias. You've survived 15 years up here through sheer determination. These cubs couldn't have found a better protector." The words hit harder than Elias expected. He'd grown so accustomed to thinking of himself as a failure, a man who'd abandoned his post when his family needed him most, that hearing someone speak of him as a protector felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. "I failed before," he said quietly. Morrison looked up from where Luna was now investigating his sleeve. "We all have. The measure of a man isn't whether he falls, it's whether he gets back up." That afternoon, after Morrison had ridden back down the mountain, with promises to return soon with supplies, Elias sat on his porch watching the cubs play. They tumbled over each other with the careless joy of youth, pouncing on fallen leaves and chasing their own tails. Scout had found a pine cone and was batting it around the clearing, while Luna stalked him from behind a pile of firewood. Their play looked so normal, so innocent, that for a moment Elias could almost forget about the hunters, the approaching winter, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But then Scout would pounce with a little too much precision, or Luna would freeze at a sound in the woods, and Elias would remember that these weren't domestic cats. They were wild predators, and teaching them to trust humans, even him, might be the kindest cruelty he could inflict. As evening approached and the cubs settled down for another night by his fireplace, Elias pulled out his leather journal and wrote by lamplight. September 15th, 1883. "The cubs are learning to drink from the bottle I made. Doc Morrison visited and offered help. For the first time in years, I don't feel completely alone. But the hunters are still out there, and winter is coming. Tomorrow, I need to start preparing defenses. These little ones are counting on me, and I won't let them down." He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, "Benjamin would have loved them." The first time Elias laughed, really laughed, in 15 years, it was because Scout had gotten his head stuck in an empty tin can. The young male had been investigating the remnants of Elias's breakfast when curiosity overcame caution. One moment he was sniffing around the discarded can, the next he was stumbling blindly around the cabin clearing, bumping into trees and mewing in frustrated confusion while Luna watched from a safe distance, her expression almost human in its amusement. Elias tried to maintain his composure, approaching slowly with gentle words. But when Scout walked straight into the cabin wall with a resounding clang, something broke loose inside the old mountain man's chest. Laughter bubbled up from a place he'd forgotten existed, deep, genuine mirth that shook his whole frame. "Easy there, you fool cub," he chuckled, carefully working the can free. "Curiosity's going to be the death of you if you're not careful." Scout, freed from his tin prison, sat back on his haunches and looked at Elias with what could only be described as wounded dignity. The sight of the young cat's ruffled fur and indignant expression sent Elias into another fit of laughter. It was then that he realized Luna was watching him with intense curiosity. She'd never heard him laugh before. None of the creatures in these mountains had. For 15 years, Elias Boone had been a man of few words and fewer smiles. But something about these cubs was awakening parts of himself he'd thought were dead and buried with his family. That evening, as the cubs settled down for the night, Elias found himself carving again. His knife moved almost without conscious direction, shaping a piece of pine into something small and playful. By the time he finished, he held a wooden mouse, perfectly sized for small paws to bat around, with a tail just long enough to make. "It's interesting. Here," he said, offering it to Luna, "something safe to play with." She approached cautiously, sniffed the carving, then gently took it in her mouth. Within moments, both cubs were tumbling over each other, the wooden mouse flying between them in a game that looked remarkably like the hunting practice it was preparing them for. Watching them play, Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in his hearth. This was what joy looked like, simple, pure, uncomplicated by the weight of past mistakes or future fears. But the outside world had a way of intruding on peaceful moments. Sheriff. Tom Bradley rode up the mountain trail 2 days later, his horse breathing hard from the climb. Elias had heard him coming for the better part of an hour. The sheriff had never been much for woodcraft, and had managed to convince the cubs to stay hidden in the cabin. "Elias," Bradley called, dismounting heavily. At 45, the sheriff carried the soft weight of a man who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence and hard-earned wisdom. "Tom," Elias nodded, stepping down from his porch. "Long way to come for a social call." "Wish it was social." Bradley's expression was grim. "Got some men in town asking questions about you. 3 of them, led by a fellow named Harwick. They seem real interested in whether you've seen any mountain lion sign lately." Elias kept his face carefully neutral. "Lots of mountain lions in these parts. What's their interest?" "They claim they're tracking a female with cubs. Say she killed some livestock down in the valley and they're hired to deal with the problem." Bradley spat into the dirt. "Course, I checked with every rancher within 50 miles, and nobody's lost so much as a chicken to cat attacks." "That's so." "What I think is these boys are in the business of hunting for profit, not protection. The kind of men who see dollar signs where decent folks see God's creatures." Bradley studied Elias carefully. "Question is, have you seen anything that might interest them?" It was a delicate moment. Bradley was a good man, honest as the day. Was long, but he was also the law. If Elias told him about the cubs, the sheriff would be bound by duty to investigate, which could lead these hunters right to his door. "Haven't seen any trouble," Elias said finally. It wasn't exactly a lie. The cubs themselves weren't trouble, even if they might bring it. Bradley nodded slowly. "I figured as much, but I wanted to give you a heads up. These men aren't the sort to take no for an answer, and they seem mighty determined to search every cabin and camp in the high country. Appreciate the warning. There's something else." Bradley's voice dropped lower. "They had papers with them, official-looking documents claiming they're authorized by the territorial government to conduct their search. But something about them didn't smell right." Inside the cabin, Elias could hear the cubs moving around, probably playing with the wooden mouse. He hoped Bradley's ears weren't as sharp as his eyes. "What kind of papers?" "Hunting permits, mostly. But also something that looked like a warrant with your name on it." Bradley's expression grew more serious. "Elias, I need to ask, is there anything in your past that might give them legal cause to come after you?" The question hit like a physical blow. Elias had spent 15 years believing he'd left his past buried, that his desertion from the army during wartime was a secret that had died with his commanding officers. Apparently, he'd been wrong. "Old business," he said carefully. "Nothing that should concern anyone now. Maybe not. But these men seem to think otherwise." Bradley stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "If you need help, any kind of help, you know where to find me. I don't like the smell of this whole situation." After the sheriff rode back down the mountain, Elias sat on his porch steps and watched the afternoon light filter through the aspen leaves. The cubs emerged from the cabin cautiously, sensing his tension. Luna pressed against his leg, while Scout investigated the hoofprints Bradley's horse had left in the clearing. The wooden mouse lay forgotten near the cabin door, and Elias picked it up, turning it over in his weathered hands. Such a simple thing, a toy carved in a moment of contentment, but it represented something precious. It represented the possibility that even broken men could create joy, could nurture instead of destroy. But now the outside world was closing, in bringing with it all the complications he'd tried to escape. The hunters weren't just after the cubs, they were after him too. Whatever papers they carried, whatever authority they claimed, it meant his carefully constructed isolation was crumbling. That night, as he wrote in his journal by firelight, Elias's entries took on a different tone. September 20th, 1883, Sheriff Bradley came with warnings. The hunters have papers with my name on them. The past has found me, just as I always feared it would, but I won't run this time. These cubs need me, and I need them more than I care to admit. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. He paused, listening to the soft breathing of the cubs sleeping by his fireplace, then added, "For the first time in 15 years, I have something worth fighting for." Elias spread the hand-drawn map across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners, with stones smoothed by 15 years of handling. Every line had been sketched from memory. Every symbol carried meaning that could mean the difference between life and death in these mountains. The red marks showed places where a man could make a stand, narrow canyon mouths that could be defended by one rifle against many, rock formations that provided cover and clear fields of fire. Blue marks indicated water sources, essential for any extended campaign. Green marks were his allies, few though they were. Doc Morrison's place in the valley, Sheriff Bradley's route into town, and the old Native American settlement where Joseph Running Bear and his people had traded with him for years. But it was the black marks that dominated the map. Every possible approach to his cabin, every trail that could bring enemies to his door. Elias had spent 3 days walking these routes, timing how long it would take armed men on horseback to reach him, identifying choke points where he could slow them down or turn them back. "Planning for war, old friend?" Elias spun toward the voice, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against the wall. But it was only Joseph Running Bear, standing in the doorway with his characteristic silent grace. The Ute elder had a way of appearing without sound, a skill that had saved both their lives more than once over the years. "Joseph," Elias relaxed, but kept his body between his visitor and the cubs who were napping near the fireplace. "Didn't hear you coming. A man who makes noise in the forest is a man who doesn't live long." Joseph's dark eyes took in the map, the scattered ammunition, the sharpened knives laid out for inspection. "You prepare for battle, maybe." Joseph stepped fully into the cabin, moving with the careful dignity of a man past 70 who had seen more winters than he cared to count. His long grey hair was braided with feathers and small bones, and his weathered face carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to read the world's moods like a book. "The spirits have been restless," he said, settling into the chair across from Elias. "They speak of men with hard hearts coming to our mountains, men who take without asking, who kill without honor." It was then that Scout chose to wake up, stretching with a yawn that revealed needle-sharp teeth. Joseph's eyes widened slightly, but he remained perfectly still as the young mountain lion padded over to investigate this new scent. "Ah," Joseph said softly, "now I understand." Luna woke as well, drawn by her brother's movement. Soon, both cubs were circling Joseph's chair, their natural curiosity overcoming any caution. The old Ute watched them with the patience of a man who had spent his life observing the wild world. "Their mother," he asked, "dead, killed by the men you spoke of." Elias's voice carried a weight of grief and anger. "They want the cubs. For money." Joseph nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "The mountain lion is sacred to my people. She teaches us about the balance between patience and action, between solitude and protection of family." He looked directly at Elias. "These little ones have chosen you as their protector. Do you understand what that means?" "I'm starting to." "Good." Joseph reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the table beside. "The map. Then you will need this." Elias picked up the pouch, feeling its weight, the smoothness of well-worn leather. Inside was a collection of items that would have looked like trinkets to most people. Small carved bones, polished stones, dried herbs, and what looked like claws from a large cat. "Medicine pouch," Joseph explained. "Made from the hide of a mountain lion who died defending her cubs 3 winters ago. She was old, past her prime, but she held off 6 wolves long enough for her young ones to escape to safety." The significance wasn't lost on Elias. "You think I'm past my prime too?" Joseph's weathered face cracked into a smile. "I think you are a man who has forgotten his own strength. But the cubs remember. They see what you have forgotten, that a protector's heart never grows old." Over the next hour, Joseph studied Elias's map with the keen eye of a military strategist. He'd fought in the Indian Wars, both for and against the U.S. Army, and his tactical knowledge rivaled that of any West Point graduate. "Here," he said, pointing to a narrow canyon about 2 miles south of the cabin. "This is where they will try to trap you. High walls, only one way out. But if you know they're coming, I could be waiting for them instead." "Yes, and here," his finger moved to a cluster of boulders near Willow Creek, "is where you could slow them down if they come from the east." A single rifle could hold this position for hours. They worked through the afternoon, refining Elias's defensive plans, identifying resources he hadn't considered. Joseph knew every water source, every game trail, every place where a man could hid or make a stand. More importantly, he knew the kind of men they were facing. "I have seen their like before," he said as the sun began to set. "They believe that want is the same as right, that having guns makes them strong. But they do not understand these mountains. They do not understand that the land itself will fight against those who take without giving back." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses reached them through the evening air. Multiple riders moving fast up the main trail. Elias grabbed his rifle while Joseph melted toward the back of the cabin. But neither man was prepared for what they saw when the riders came into view. Sarah Mitchell rode at the head of the group, her auburn hair flowing behind her as she urged her horse up the steep incline. Behind her came Doc Morrison and 2 men Elias didn't recognize, one young, one middle-aged, both carrying the confident bearing of men comfortable with weapons. Sarah had run the trading post in Pine Ridge for 3 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident. She was 35, intelligent, and possessed of a quiet strength that reminded Elias of Margaret in ways that both comforted and unsettled him. "Elias," she called, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. "We need to talk." The cubs, startled by the commotion, pressed close to Elias's legs. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw them, but her expression quickly shifted from surprise to fierce protectiveness. "Oh my," she breathed, kneeling slowly. "They're beautiful." "Sarah," Elias said carefully, "what are you doing here?" She looked up at him with eyes that held steel beneath their kindness. "What I should have done days ago. These men, Harwick and his bunch, they came through my store asking questions, offering money for information about you and any exotic animals you might be harboring." The young man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Name's Miller. This is my partner, Webb. We're federal marshals, and we need to talk." Marshal Miller was younger than Elias had expected, perhaps 30, with the earnest eyes of a man who still believed the law could make the world right. His partner, Webb, carried himself with the careful economy of movement that marked a veteran lawman, someone who had learned that survival often depended on reading situations correctly. The first time, "Mr. Boone," Miller began, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah had insisted on making. "We're here about Ezra Harwick and his associates. They're operating under what appear to be forged federal documents." Elias felt something loosen in his chest. Relief. He hadn't realized he'd been holding forged. "Completely fabricated," Webb confirmed, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of too many years and too much whiskey. "The signatures are decent forgeries, but the seal is wrong, and the authorization. Codes don't match anything in our records." Sarah set down her coffee cup with enough force to make the cubs look up from where they were playing with the wooden mouse. "That's not all. They've been through every trading post between here and Denver, spinning the same story about dangerous predators and official hunting licenses. The question is," Miller continued, "what's their real game? 3 men don't come this far into mountain country just for a pair of cubs, no matter how exotic." Joseph, who had been listening in silence from his position near the fireplace, finally spoke. "They seek something else. The cubs are perhaps, how do you say, the cover for their true purpose. What makes you think that? Webb asked, showing more respect for the old Utes' opinion than most white lawmen would. Because they ask too many questions about the wrong things. Who lives in the high country, where the old mining claims are? Which trails lead to the hidden valleys? Joseph's dark eyes met Elias's across the room. They hunt for more than animals. Dr. Morrison, who had been examining Scout with gentle hands, looked up from his impromptu veterinary work. There have been rumors for years about gold strikes in the high country. Nothing proven, but enough whispers to draw treasure hunters, or men looking to stake claims on territory that's technically still disputed, Webb added grimly. The territorial boundaries aren't as clear as most people think, especially up here. Luna had been exploring the cabin with increasing boldness, and now she approached Sarah with cautious curiosity. Sarah remained perfectly still, letting the young mountain lion investigate her scent, her clothing, the gentle sound of her breathing. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, wonder clear in her voice. "How old are they?" 10 weeks, maybe 12, Morrison answered. "Old enough to start learning hunting skills, but still completely dependent for food and protection." Scout, having concluded that the doctor's examination wasn't entirely unpleasant, padded over to investigate Miller. The young marshal watched with fascination as the cub sniffed his boots, his holster, the brass buttons on his coat. "I've never seen anything like this," Miller admitted. "Wild cats treating humans like family. That's exactly what we are to them," Elias said quietly. "They imprinted on me when they were desperate and alone. As far as they know, I'm their father." The weight of that responsibility settled over the room like a blanket. Even the marshals, trained to think in terms of law and procedure, seemed to understand that this went beyond simple animal ownership. "Which brings us to the real problem," Webb said, his voice gentle but firm. "Even if Harwick's papers are forgeries, that doesn't change the fact that keeping wild mountain lions is technically illegal under territorial law." The coffee cup trembled. In Elias's hands, after everything they'd been through, everything they'd built together, was the law going to tear his small family apart anyway? "However," Miller continued quickly, seeing Elias's expression, "there are provisions for wildlife, rescue and rehabilitation, especially in cases where the animals were orphaned through illegal hunting activities." Sarah reached into her coat and pulled out a folded document. "Which is why I brought this. It's a petition I've been circulating in town, requesting that you be granted official status as a wildlife rehabilitator. Doc Morrison started it, but half the town has signed on." Elias took the paper with hands that weren't quite steady. Name after name filled the page. People he'd traded with over the years, folks who'd benefited from his knowledge of medicinal plants, families he'd helped during harsh winters when his hunting skills meant the difference between eating and going hungry. "I had no idea so many people even knew I existed," he said softly. "You've done more good in these mountains than you realize," Morrison said. "People remember kindness, Elias. They remember when someone helps without asking for anything in return." Joseph pulled something from his coat, a medicine pouch made from tanned hide, decorated with intricate beadwork and small carved bones. The leather was old, worn smooth by countless hands, and it emanated a sense of significance that made even the marshals fall silent. "This belonged to the cub's mother," Joseph said, offering it to Elias. "I found it near the place where she died, along with parts of her hide that the hunters left behind. In my tradition, when a mother dies protecting her young, her spirit remains to guide and protect them through the medicine pouch." Elias accepted the pouch with reverence, feeling its weight, not just physical but spiritual. As his fingers traced the intricate beadwork, Luna suddenly approached and pressed her head against his hand, as if she recognized something familiar in the scent. "She knows," Joseph said simply. "The cubs understand that their mother's spirit remains with them, but now it flows through you. You are not replacing her, you are carrying on her work." That evening, as the marshals and Dr. Morrison prepared to head back down the mountain, Webb pulled Elias aside. "Those forgeries Harwick is carrying, they're good enough to fool most local officials, but they won't stand up to federal scrutiny," he said quietly. "The problem is, if we move against him now, before we understand his real objective, he might just disappear and surface somewhere else. What are you suggesting? Let him come to you. We'll be watching, but from a distance. When he makes his move, whatever that move turns out to be, we'll be ready." Webb's weathered face was grim. "I won't lie to you, Boone. It's going to be dangerous, but sometimes the only way to end a threat is to let it show its true face." As the visitors rode away into the gathering darkness, Elias stood on his porch, with the cubs at his feet and the medicine pouch in his hands. The leather was warm against his palm, and for a moment he could almost feel a presence, protective, fierce, maternal. "Don't worry, Mama Cat," he whispered to the mountain knight. "I'll keep them safe." The wanted poster was nailed to a pine tree, just 50 yards from Elias's cabin, where he couldn't possibly miss it during his morning routine. His own face stared back at him from the yellowed paper. 15 years younger, clean-shaven, wearing the uniform of a United States Army sergeant. The text below the photograph was brief but damning. "Wanted for desertion in time of war. Sergeant Elias Matthew Boone, 3rd Colorado Cavalry. Reward, $500 dead or alive. Last seen fleeing his post during the Battle of Sand Creek, November 1864. Considered armed and extremely dangerous." Elias's hands shook as he read the lies printed beneath his younger self's image. Sand Creek. They were using Sand Creek against him, twisting one of the most shameful episodes in military history to make him look like a coward. But the truth was far more complicated. The cubs sensed his distress immediately, pressing against his legs as he stood frozen beneath the pine tree. Scout mewed softly, the same sound he made when seeking comfort during thunderstorms. Luna wound herself around his ankles, her small body warm against the morning chill. Footsteps approached through the timber, multiple sets moving with the practiced stealth of men who knew their business. Elias didn't run. There was nowhere to go, and the cubs couldn't move fast enough to escape, even if there was. Harwick emerged from the trees first, his rifle casually pointed in Elias's direction. Behind him came his 2 associates, spread out to cover multiple angles. They'd learned from military tactics, these men, professional hunters indeed. "Morning, Sergeant Boone," Harwick said, his voice carrying mock civility. "Or do you prefer deserter?" "I prefer Elias," he replied quietly, his hands moving slowly to show he wasn't reaching for weapons. "And you can put the rifles down. I'm not going anywhere." Harwick's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Oh, but you are. See that poster there? That's genuine federal paper, not like some of the other documents floating around these parts. We're officially deputized to bring you in, alive or dead, for military justice." The younger hunter, the one called Peters, shifted nervously. "What about the cats, Harwick? That's why we came up here. The cats are just a bonus, boy. Always were." Harwick never took his eyes off Elias. "See, Sergeant Boone here is worth more than a dozen mountain lion pelts. $500 is serious money." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How did you know where to find me?" "Military records. Took some digging, but your name was in the files of every man who served in the Colorado Territory. Once we knew you were up here, it was just a matter of time. And the forged papers the marshals mentioned?" Harwick's grin widened. "Oh, those were real enough for what we needed. Federal hunting permits, territorial authority to search for dangerous wildlife. Enough official-looking documentation to keep the local law off our backs while we tracked." "You down?" The third man, stocky and silent, finally spoke. "What I don't understand is why a military deserter would risk exposure for a couple of wild cats." It was then that Elias realized they didn't know the whole truth. They saw the wanted poster, saw the potential reward, but they didn't understand what had really happened at Sand Creek. "You want to know why I left my post?" Elias asked, his voice growing stronger. "You want to know what kind of battle Sand Creek really was?" Harwick's expression flickered, just for a moment, suggesting he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't a battle, Elias continued, his words carrying the weight of 19 years of suppressed truth. It was a massacre. Women and children, mostly, unarmed, flying a white flag of surrender and an American flag that was supposed to protect them. The cubs had moved closer to him, sensing the tension in his voice. Scout positioned himself between Elias and the armed men, his small body trembling with protective instincts he was too young to understand. "Colonel Chivington ordered us to kill everything that moved, said nits make lice." That's how he talked about children. Elias's voice grew harder. Some of the men followed orders. Others couldn't stomach it. She was one who couldn't. Peters looked uncomfortable, glancing between Harwick and Elias. "That's not what the poster says." "The poster says what the army wanted it to say, after the newspapers started asking uncomfortable questions." Elias kept his hands visible, but his voice carried the authority of a man who had once commanded respect. "I didn't desert in the face of enemy fire. I refused to participate in the murder of innocents." Harwick spat into the dirt. "Touching story. Doesn't change the fact that you're worth $500 to us." "Actually, it does." The new voice came from the trees behind Harwick's men, calm, authoritative, and completely unexpected. Marshal Webb stepped into the clearing, his badge visible on his coat, his rifle aimed at Harwick's back. "Gentlemen, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping of a federal witness." Harwick spun around, his own rifle swinging toward the marshal. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about this." Webb held up an official document with one hand, while keeping his rifle steady with the other. "Presidential pardon for Sergeant Elias Boone, signed by Ulysses S. Grant himself and dated March 15, 1865. Full exoneration for his refusal to participate in what the President called actions contrary to the honor and dignity of the United States Army." The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of wind in the pines and the soft breathing of the cubs. Elias felt the world shift around him, as if everything he'd believed about himself for 19 years was suddenly revealed. "To be built on lies, that's impossible," Harwick snarled. "Military desertion is military desertion." "Not when the desertion was actually an act of conscience, later validated by congressional investigation," Webb replied. "The Sand Creek massacre was officially condemned by the U.S. government. Men like Sergeant Boone, who refused to participate, were quietly pardoned, and their records cleared." Miller emerged from another direction, flanking Harwick's remaining men. "The question is, how did you get hold of a wanted poster that was officially rescinded 20 years ago?" Peters dropped his rifle and raised his hands. "We found it in Harwick's gear, said it was legitimate federal paper." Harwick's face had gone pale, but his rifle remained aimed at Webb. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can." Sarah's voice carried across the clearing as she led Dr. Morrison and Joseph Running Bear into view. "Because that poster isn't the only forged document you've been carrying." Joseph held up a leather satchel. "Found this in your camp last night. Full of documents. Some real, some not. Some very interesting correspondence about mineral rights and territorial claims. The pieces fell into place in Elias's mind like tumblers in a lock. You weren't after the cubs or the reward money. You were after the land." "Smart man," Harwick said, his finger moving toward his trigger. "This whole area sits on what could be the richest gold deposits in Colorado Territory. But there are too many legitimate settlers, too many legal claims to file. Easier to clear out the hermits and squatters first, then move in with proper documentation." "Documentation you were forging," Webb said. "Documentation we were creating," Harwick corrected. "Amazing what you can accomplish with the right printing equipment and a few well-placed bribes," Scout suddenly hissed, a sound Elias had never heard from him before. The young mountain lion had spotted something the humans had missed. Harwick's finger tightening on his trigger, his body shifting for a clear shot at Webb. "Down!" Elias shouted, diving toward the cubs as Harwick's rifle boomed across the clearing. But the shot went wide because Luna, in a display of protective instinct that defied her young age, had launched herself at Harwick's leg, her needle sharp. Claws finding purchase in his thigh. The man's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the canyon walls as his rifle flew from his hands. When the dust settled, Harwick was on the ground with Luna sitting on his chest, her small face inches from his nose, growling with a sound that promised future retribution. Scout had positioned himself over the fallen rifle, as if he understood its significance. Webb and Miller quickly disarmed the remaining hunters, while Dr. Morrison checked everyone for injuries. Sarah knelt beside Elias, who was gathering the cubs close to his chest. "It's over," she said softly. "It's finally over." But as Elias looked down at the cubs who had just risked their lives to protect him, he realized it wasn't over at all. It was just beginning. The Medal of Honor lay in Elias's weathered palm, like a piece of his forgotten soul, its bronze surface tarnished, but still catching the lamplight that flickered across his cabin walls. Marshal Webb had handed it to him an hour ago, along with a leather portfolio containing documents that rewrote the story of his entire life. "Congressional Medal of Honor," Webb had said quietly, "awarded posthumously to Sergeant Elias Matthew Boone for extraordinary heroism in saving the lives of 17 Cheyenne women and children during the Sand Creek incident. The award was rescinded when you were declared dead, then restored when we discovered you were very much alive." Now, sitting at his kitchen table with the cubs sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, Elias tried to reconcile this bronze medal with the man he'd believed himself to be for nearly 20 years. According to the documents, he hadn't just refused to participate in the massacre. He'd actively worked to save lives, leading non-combatants to safety while bullets flew around them. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "You saved 17 people," she said softly. 17 human beings who went on to live, to have families, to contribute to the world. And you carried guilt about it for 20 years. "I remember it differently," Elias said, turning the medal over in his hands. "I remember chaos, confusion, making decisions that felt like cowardice. I remember running. You remember what trauma." "As to memory," Dr. Morrison interjected from his chair near the fire, "the mind protects itself from unbearable truths sometimes. You weren't running from your duty, you were running toward it." Joseph Running Bear nodded from where he sat cross-legged on the floor, one hand resting gently on Scout's sleeping form. "My grandfather was at Sand Creek. He survived because a soldier, a white soldier with kind eyes, led him and others away from the killing. He described this soldier many times in the stories he told." Elias looked up sharply. "Your grandfather?" "White. He lived to be 93, died just 5 years ago. His last words were a prayer for the soldier who saved him." Joseph's dark eyes met Elias's across the room. He would be pleased to know his prayer was finally answered. The weight of revelation was almost crushing. For 20 years, Elias had carried the belief that he was a coward, a deserter, a man who had failed when courage was needed most. The guilt over his family's death had seemed like just punishment for his military failures. But if this medal was real, if these documents were true, then everything he'd built his identity around was wrong. Marshal Miller cleared his throat from his position by the window, where he'd been watching the trails for any sign of trouble. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss what happens next. Harwick and his men are secured for now, but their operation was bigger than just the 3 of them." Webb nodded grimly. "We found evidence in their camp of at least 6 other men working the territory. Bank records show they've been buying up mineral rights using forged documentation for months. This was a systematic land grab operation. And when Harwick doesn't report in," Miller continued, "his partners are going to come looking, probably with more men and better weapons than we can handle up here." Sarah leaned forward. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be days." Could be hours. Webb's expression was grim. The smart play would be to get everyone off this mountain until federal reinforcements can clean up the mess. Elias looked down at the cubs, now stirring from their nap at the sound of voices. Luna stretched and padded over to investigate his boots, while Scout sat up and fixed him with those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I'm not running," he said quietly. "Elias," Sarah began. "No." His voice carried a firmness that surprised even him. "I've spent 20 years running from who I thought I was. These cubs trust me to protect them, and this mountain is their home. I won't abandon them again." "Again?" Dr. Morrison asked gently. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the Medal of Honor. "Margaret and Benjamin," he said finally. "My wife and son. They died while I was in military prison, waiting for court-martial proceedings that never came. I wasn't there when they needed me most." "You were in prison for doing the right thing," Sarah said firmly. "For saving lives. Doesn't matter. They called for me, and I wasn't there." Elias looked up at the faces surrounding him, good people who had risked their lives to help him, who had shown him kindnesses he didn't deserve. "I won't make that mistake again." Joseph smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Elias had seen from the old Ute in years. "Now you sound like the man Whitehawk described, the soldier who chose to save rather than destroy." Scout chose that moment to approach Elias's chair, standing on his hind legs to place his front paws on Elias's knee. The young mountain lion looked directly into his eyes with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. "He knows," Joseph said softly. "They both know. The cubs understand that you have found your true self again." Miller moved away from the window, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "If we're staying, we need a plan. This cabin isn't defensible against a large force." Elias stood up, gently moving Scout aside, and walked to the map still spread across. His table, the red marks, the defensive positions he'd identified, suddenly took on new significance. He wasn't just planning to hide anymore, he was planning to fight. "Here," he said, pointing to a narrow canyon mouth about a mile from the cabin. "Devil's Gap. Only wide enough for 2 men to pass through at a time, with good cover on both sides. If we can funnel them through there, we can control the engagement," Webb finished, understanding immediately. "Classic military tactics." "The cubs can't stay here," Sarah said. "Whatever happens, they need to be somewhere safe." Joseph stood slowly, his old bones creaking with the effort. "There is a place. Sacred cave in the high country, where my people once kept important things safe from enemies. The cubs will be protected there." "How far?" Elias asked. "Half-day's travel if you know the path." "I will take them." The plan began to form like a storm gathering strength. Joseph would lead the cubs to safety in the high country while the others prepared defensive positions. Dr. Morrison would return to town to alert the territorial authorities and request immediate federal assistance. Sarah would coordinate supplies and communications from her trading post, but as they discussed logistics and timing, Elias found himself studying the faces of these people who had become his allies, his friends. Sarah, whose quiet strength reminded him of Margaret's gentle courage. Dr. Morrison, whose compassion had kept him connected to humanity during his darkest years. Joseph, whose wisdom had helped him understand the spiritual significance of his bond with the cubs. Webb and Miller, who represented a law that was finally working in service of justice rather than expedience. "There's something else," Webb said, pulling another document from his portfolio. "This came through official channels just before we rode up here. It's an appointment, temporary federal wildlife marshal for this territory. Seems there's been growing concern about illegal hunting operations in the region." He handed Elias a badge, simple brass, but bearing the seal of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. "The job comes with full federal authority to protect wildlife and prosecute those who threaten it. Salary's not much, but it includes official recognition of your right to care for orphaned animals." Elias stared at the badge, feeling the weight of official sanction for work he'd been doing informally for years. "Why me?" "Because," Miller said with a slight smile, "according to these reports, you're the most qualified wildlife expert in the Colorado Territory. 15 years of detailed observations, successful animal rehabilitation, and demonstrated knowledge of wilderness survival. Plus you've got a Medal of Honor for protecting the innocent." Luna padded over and rubbed against Elias's leg, as if she understood that something important was happening. Scout followed, and soon both cubs were pressed against him, their warm bodies a reminder of why all this planning and preparation mattered. "When do we start?" Elias asked, pinning the badge to his shirt. "We already have," Sarah replied, standing and moving to gather her things. "Joseph, how long do you need to get the cubs to safety?" "We leave at first light. The path is difficult, but we will reach the sacred cave before sunset." Dr. Morrison was already packing his medical bag. "I'll ride hard for town. Should be able to get word to the territorial governor's office by tomorrow evening." Webb and Miller began checking their weapons and ammunition. "We'll coordinate the defense here. If Harwick's partners are coming, we'll be ready for them." As the cabin filled with the purposeful energy of people preparing for battle, Elias found himself looking down at the Medal of Honor still clutched in his hand. For 20 years, he'd believed he was a man running from his failures. Now he understood the truth. He was a man who had always fought for what was right, even when it cost him everything. The cubs settled down near his feet, their breathing slow and peaceful, in the way of creatures who trusted completely in their protector's ability to keep them safe. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new tests of courage and resolve. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Elias Boone knew exactly who he was. The signal fire mirror caught the morning sun like a beacon of defiance, sending flashes of light across the valley that could be seen for miles. Elias adjusted the angle carefully, following the code Joseph had taught him years ago. 3 short flashes, 2 long pause, repeat. The message was simple: ready, come ahead. 6 riders emerged from the timber below, moving in the loose formation, of men who knew their business but had grown overconfident. Through his field glasses, Elias could make out their leader, a man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. This would be Colonel Rawlings, Harwick's superior, in whatever organization they truly represented. "Federal marshals, my foot," Webb muttered from his position among the rocks 20 yards to Elias's left. "Those boys move like military, but not our military." Miller's voice carried across the gap between their positions, carefully modulated, to avoid echoing off the canyon walls. Confederate irregulars, maybe? Men who never accepted the war was over? It would make sense, Elias thought, as he watched the riders approach the narrow mouth of Devil's Gap. Ex-Confederate officers, bitter about defeat, seeing opportunity in the chaos of territorial expansion, using forged federal documents to steal land, planning to establish their own kingdom in the mountains where federal authority was weak. The cubs were safe. He'd watched Joseph lead them up the hidden trail toward the sacred cave just after dawn, Luna looking back over her shoulder one last time before disappearing into the high timber. That knowledge gave him a calm he hadn't felt since this whole ordeal began. Whatever happened today, Scout and Luna would survive. The signal mirror was an old cavalry piece, something he'd carried from his army days and somehow never thrown away. Now it served as the perfect tool for coordination. 1 flash to confirm positions, 2 flashes for movement, 3 for immediate danger. Simple, clear, impossible to misinterpret. Sarah's voice reached him from the trading post's back room, where she was coordinating with Dr. Morrison via telegraph. "Federal troops are 6 hours out from Fort Collins. Sheriff Bradley is organizing every able-bodied man in 3 counties. Help is coming." "Might not have 6 hours," Elias replied, watching the riders pause at the canyon entrance. The leader was studying the terrain with the eye of a professional soldier. noting the narrowness of the passage, the elevated positions on either side, the clear tactical disadvantage of entering such an obvious kill zone. But Rawlings also understood that his quarry was trapped. The canyon had only one exit, and his men controlled it. Time was on his side, or so he believed. Elias Boone. The voice echoed off the canyon walls, magnified and distorted by the stone. "I know you're up there. We have business to discuss." Elias checked his rifle one more time, a habit from his army days that had probably saved his life more than once. 6 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 20 more in his belt. Enough for a good fight if it came to that. "I'm listening," he called back, his voice carrying the authority of a man wearing a federal badge. "You've caused us considerable trouble, Boone. Interfered with legitimate business operations. Assaulted our representatives. Harbored stolen property." "Stolen? Improperty?" The words came out sharper than Elias intended. "Those cubs aren't property. They're living creatures you orphaned for profit." Rawlings' laugh carried no humor. "Everything's property, Boone. Land, animals, people. It's all about who has the power to take and keep. Right now, that's us." Webb shifted position among the rocks, his rifle trained on the canyon mouth. Miller had moved to cover the alternate trail that wound up the south face of the ridge. A harder climb, but possible for determined men. The signal mirror flashed once from Sarah's position, confirmation that the telegraph lines were still open. Twice from the direction of the main trail, Dr. Morrison had reached the checkpoint and was coordinating with incoming federal forces. 3 times from the high country, Joseph had reached the cave and the cubs were secure. "Last chance, Boone," Rawlings called. "Walk down here with your hands visible and we'll make this quick. Force us to come up there, and it gets messy for everyone." Elias looked down at the federal badge pinned to his shirt, then at the Medal of Honor tucked into his pocket. For 20 years he'd believed he was a man who ran when courage was needed. Now he knew better. "Here's my counter-offer," he called back, his voice echoing with new confidence. "You and your men turn around and ride back where you came from. Consider it professional courtesy from one soldier to another." "Soldier?" Rawlings sounded genuinely amused. "You're no soldier, Boone. You're a deserter who's been hiding in the mountains like a coward." The words should have stung, but they bounced off Elias like rain off stone. He knew who he was now, what he'd always been. "Medal of Honor recipient," he replied calmly. "Federal wildlife marshal, and a man who's done running from bullies like you." The silence that followed was so complete that Elias could hear the wind moving through the pines above their positions. Then Rawlings' voice came back, harder now, stripped of false civility. "Take them." The carved wooden whistle hung around Elias's neck on a leather cord, its surface worn smooth by countless touches over the weeks since he'd made it. He'd carved it during one of those peaceful evenings when the cubs were learning to respond to his calls, never imagining it would serve as anything more than a training tool. Now, as gunfire erupted in the canyon below, he pressed the whistle to his lips and blew a single piercing note that echoed off the stone walls like a war cry. Divai, sound that answered from the high country made his heart skip. 2 distinct roars, young but fierce, carrying across the mountain air like a promise. Scout and Luna had heard his call and were answering, even from their safe hiding place miles away. "They're coming up the south face." Miller's warning cracked across the battlefield as 3 of Rawlings' men attempted to flank their position. The young marshal's rifle spoke twice in quick succession, sending chips of granite flying near the climbers' heads. Elias swung his own rifle toward the canyon mouth, where Rawlings and 2 others were using their horses as cover while they advanced. The colonel was no fool. He understood that controlling the narrow passage was key to victory, even if it meant sacrificing some of his men to the defenders' elevated positions. "Boone," Sarah's voice carried from the trading post. "Telegraph line's been cut. We're on our own until the cavalry arrives." That meant no more coordination with outside forces, no way to call for immediate help. But it also meant Rawlings couldn't call for reinforcements either. This fight would be decided by the people already on the mountain. Webb's rifle cracked from his position among the boulders, and one of the flanking attackers cried out, tumbling back down the rocky slope. "That's one," the veteran marshal called. "Who's counting?" Elias found himself smiling grimly as he drew a bead on Rawlings' position. The colonel was using military tactics, but he was fighting on Elias's ground now, terrain the mountain man had studied and prepared for weeks. A bullet whined off the rock near his head, spraying granite dust across his cheek. Rawlings had spotted his muzzle flash and was returning fire with the precision of a trained marksman. But Elias had already moved, rolling to a new position behind a fallen log. The whistle bumped against his chest as he took aim again, and suddenly he heard something impossible, the sound of large paws moving through the timber above their position. Not possible. Joseph would never bring the cubs back into danger, unless... Scout appeared at the edge of the clearing like a golden ghost, no longer the small, helpless creature who had stumbled into Elias's camp weeks ago. The young mountain lion had grown, his muscles filling out, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a predator coming into his power. Behind him came Luna, smaller but equally transformed, her eyes bright with intelligence and determination. Somehow they had escaped from Joseph's protective custody and found their way back to the battle. "No," Elias whispered, his heart clenching with fear. "Get back, get to safety." But the cubs had made their choice. As Rawlings' remaining men pressed their attack up the narrow canyon, Scout and Luna moved like shadows through the timber, positioning themselves above the battlefield with the tactical awareness of creatures born to hunt. Rawlings had reached the widest part of the canyon, where his superior numbers could spread out and bring concentrated fire to bear on the defenders' positions. 3 men advanced, while 2 others provided covering fire, a textbook military maneuver executed with professional precision. It might have worked against ordinary opponents, but they weren't fighting ordinary opponents anymore. Scout's roar split. The mountain air, no longer the mew of a kitten, but the challenge of a young predator defending his territory. The sound froze Rawlings' men for a crucial second, their heads turning toward this new threat. That second was all Webb needed. His rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession, and 2 of the advancing men went down. Miller's weapon added its voice from the south ridge, pinning the flankers behind inadequate cover. But it was Luna who ended the fight. The young female had circled around behind Rawlings' position, moving with the silent grace her mother had died defending. When the colonel rose to direct his men's fire, she was there, 60 pounds of fury and fang, launching herself from the rocks above. Rawlings went down hard, his rifle flying from his hands as Luna's claws found purchase in his coat. He rolled, frantically trying to throw her off, but Scout had arrived to support his sister. "Surrender!" Elias called, rising from his cover with his rifle trained on the remaining attackers. "Your leader's down, your flankers are pinned. You've got one chance to walk away from this." The surviving men looked at their colonel, flat on his back, with 2 young mountain lions standing over him like avenging spirits, and slowly raised their hands. As the echoes of gunfire faded from the canyon walls, Elias walked down to where Rawlings lay motionless. The cubs stepped aside as he approached, their trust in him absolute, even in the aftermath of violence. "It's over," he said quietly, kneeling to check the colonel's pulse. Unconscious but alive, Luna had used restraint rather than killing force. The wooden whistle hung warm against his chest, and Elias realized that the bond between him and the cubs had grown beyond simple protection. They were family now, in the truest sense, creatures who would risk everything to defend each other. Webb and Miller emerged from their positions, weapons ready but no longer needed. "Nice work," Webb said, looking down at the subdued attackers. "All of them alive to stand trial." In the distance, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of federal reinforcements. But the battle was already won, not just the immediate fight, but the larger war for who Elias Boone truly was. As Scout and Luna pressed against his legs, he finally understood. He wasn't a man who ran from his responsibilities. He was a man who stood and fought for what mattered most. The sketch was Sarah's idea, drawn during one of those golden October afternoons when the aspen leaves painted the mountainside in shades of fire and honey. She'd positioned herself on a fallen log near the cabin porch, her pencils arranged beside her like an artist's prayer, capturing the scene that had become their new normal. In the drawing, Elias sat on his porch steps with Scout stretched out. Beside him, the young mountain lion's head resting on his knee with casual affection. Luna lounged in a patch of sunlight nearby, her spotted coat beginning to show the rosettes that would mark her adult coloring. Behind them, the cabin looked more lived in than it had in 15 years. Flower boxes Sarah had installed, wind, chimes that Dr. Morrison had brought from town, a second rocking chair that spoke of companionship rather than solitude. "There," Sarah said, adding a final detail to Elias's weathered hands. "That's how I want to remember this place, this moment." 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Devil's Gap. The federal courts had moved swiftly to prosecute Rawlings, and his associates. Their scheme to forge territorial documents and steal mineral rights had unraveled completely once investigators began pulling threads. The ex-Confederate colonel would spend the next 20 years in a federal prison, along with the network of accomplices who had helped him operate across 3 territories. But the legal resolution was only part of the story. The real transformation lay in the daily rhythms that had emerged on Elias's mountain. Dr. Morrison made his visits more frequently now, ostensibly to monitor the cubs' development, but really because he'd found family here among the pines. He'd been documenting their growth with scientific precision. Scout now weighed nearly 90 pounds and stood as tall as a large dog, while Luna had reached 60 pounds and displayed the intelligence that would make her a formidable hunter. There, reaching the age where they should be establishing territory, Morrison observed, checking his notes against the cubs' current behavior. In the wild, they'd be leaving their mother's protection soon. But these weren't wild cubs in the traditional sense anymore. They'd learned to navigate the boundaries between their natural instincts and their bond with humans. Scout had developed a routine of morning patrols around the valley, marking his territory but always returning to the cabin by evening. Luna preferred hunting practice, stalking chipmunks and rabbits with increasing skill, though she rarely made actual kills. Joseph Running Bear visited weekly, bringing news from the tribal council and wisdom about managing the balance between wild and domestic. The old Ute had become something of a celebrity after word spread about his role in protecting the mountain lions, and he used his newfound influence to advocate for wildlife preservation across the territory. "The spirits are pleased," he told Elias during one of his visits. "The cubs have learned to walk in both worlds, the world of their ancestors and the world of their chosen family. This is harmony." Sheriff Bradley had been promoted to territorial marshal, largely on the strength of his work exposing the Rawlings conspiracy. He still made occasional visits to the mountain, but now they felt more like social calls than official business. The federal wildlife marshal badge Elias wore had given him genuine authority to protect the region's animals, and his appointment had been made permanent after a congressional review of his qualifications. Sarah had been the biggest change in Elias's daily life. She'd started visiting more frequently after the crisis passed, initially to help with the cubs' care, but increasingly just to share meals and conversation. Her trading post in Pine Ridge thrived under her management, but she'd begun spending weekends on the mountain, sleeping in the small addition they'd built onto the cabin's north side. "I never thought I'd live anywhere but town," she admitted one evening as they sat watching the cubs play in the clearing. "But there's something about this place, something about you and them. It feels like home." The romance had grown slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who understood that trust was built through consistent actions rather than passionate declarations. Elias found himself remembering how to care for someone beyond mere survival needs, while Sarah discovered that love could exist without the fear of sudden loss that had marked her first marriage. The cubs had accepted her completely, treating her with the same protective affection they showed Elias. They seemed to understand that she was part of their pride now, part of the family structure that provided security and purpose. On this particular afternoon, as Sarah finished her sketch, Scout suddenly lifted his head from Elias's knee and looked toward the trail that led down the mountain. His ears pricked forward, and Luna immediately went alert as well. "Company coming," Elias said, recognizing the signs. The cubs had developed an uncanny ability to detect visitors long before human senses could pick up any indication. 20 minutes later, Marshal Webb rode into the clearing, followed by a man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable on horseback. Behind them came a small wagon driven by Dr. Morrison, who was grinning like a man with excellent news. "Elias," Webb called. "Got someone here who wants to meet you." The man in the suit dismounted carefully and approached with the measured steps of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than mountain trails. "Mr. Boone, I'm James Hartford from the Smithsonian Institution. We've been following your work with considerable interest. As it turned out, the scientific community had become fascinated by the cubs' unique development. Hartford represented a consortium of Eastern universities that wanted to fund a formal study of human mountain-lion interaction, with Elias as the primary researcher. The position comes with a substantial salary, Hartford explained, and official recognition as a pioneer in wildlife behavioral studies. You'd be working with the finest minds in natural science. It was a generous offer. More money than Elias had ever imagined, academic prestige, a chance to contribute to scientific knowledge, everything he'd never known he wanted. But as he considered the proposal, Scout moved closer to his side, while Luna positioned herself where she could watch both the visitors and the forest beyond. Sarah's hand found his, warm and steady, and he caught the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that had become the perfume of home. "I appreciate the offer," Elias said finally, "but I've got everything I need right here." Hartford looked genuinely puzzled. "Sir, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the chance to change how the world understands wildlife." Elias looked down at the family portrait Sarah had sketched, a weathered mountain man, 2 magnificent cats, and a cabin that had become the center of something larger than any individual life. "Mister," he said with quiet certainty, "I'm already living a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." As the visitors departed with polite bewilderment, Sarah leaned against his shoulder while the cubs settled back into their afternoon contentment. Mountain evening was approaching, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called to its mate. Elias Boone had spent 20 years searching for redemption in solitude. Instead, he'd found it in family, in purpose, and in the simple truth that sometimes the greatest courage is choosing to stay rather than leave. The sketch captured it perfectly. A man who had learned to trust his own heart, surrounded by the creatures who had taught him that love could grow even in the most unlikely circumstances.